I predicted the dollar's decline. Now I'm predicting which currency replaces it. Welcome back to the channel. Just 72 hours ago, on April 28, 2026, the International Monetary Fund released its quarterly reserve currency composition report. And buried on page 47, in a table that no cable news anchor will ever read on air, was a number that should have detonated like a financial warhead across every trading floor on the planet. The US dollar share of global central bank reserves has fallen to 56.1%. Let me repeat that, 56.1%. That is the lowest figure since the IMF began tracking reserve composition in 1995. That is a decline of nearly 15 percentage points from the 71% share the dollar held in 2001. And that is the number I predicted on this channel 14 months ago, when every mainstream economist, every Treasury official, and every Wall Street analyst was assuring you that the dollar's reserve status was eternal, unshakable, and guaranteed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. On this channel, we don't just read the headlines, we read the data tables that the headlines are designed to distract you from. And today I am making another prediction, a prediction about which currency, which system, or which mechanism will ultimately replace the dollar as the anchor of the global financial system. The answer is not what you expect. What specific forces are driving the dollar's decline? Why have central banks from Beijing to Brasilia been dumping dollar reserves at the fastest pace in modern history? What are the three leading candidates to replace the dollar, and which one is actually winning? Stay with us. If you want analysis that follows the money instead of the narrative, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Drop your prediction in the comments. The dollar's decline is not a natural market process. It is a consequence of deliberate policy decisions made in Washington that have systematically undermined the trust that global reserve currency status requires. The first and most catastrophic of those decisions was the freezing of approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves in February 2022, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That freeze was intended to punish Moscow. What it actually accomplished was something far more consequential. It taught every central bank governor on earth that dollar-denominated reserves held abroad are not sovereign assets. They are hostages, subject to seizure at any moment that Washington decides a country's behavior is unacceptable. The freeze did not just punish Russia. It educated China, India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, Indonesia, South Africa, Turkey, and every other nation holding significant dollar reserves that their national savings could be confiscated by political decision, without judicial process, without appeal, and without recourse. The response was immediate and measurable. In the 12 months following the freeze, central banks worldwide purchased over 1,100 metric tons of gold, the largest annual gold acquisition since 1967. China's central bank alone added over 200 tons to its reserves, while simultaneously reducing its holdings of U.S. Treasury securities by over $100 billion. The message was unmistakable. The world's central banks were diversifying away from the dollar, not because they had found a better currency, but because they had concluded that the dollar was no longer safe. The second force driving the decline is the weaponization of the SWIFT payment system. SWIFT, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, processes approximately 42 million financial messages per day, facilitating over $5 trillion in daily cross-border transactions. When the United States expelled major Russian banks from SWIFT in 2022, it achieved the immediate tactical objective of disrupting Russian financial flows. But it also demonstrated that SWIFT, which the global financial system had treated as neutral infrastructure, was in reality an American weapon that could be deployed against any country at any time. The response again was immediate. Russia developed SPFS, its own financial messaging system, now processing over 20% of Russian cross-border transactions. China expanded CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system, which now connects over 1,400 financial institutions across 113 countries. India launched UPI International, extending its domestic digital payment system to cross-border transactions with 22 countries and counting. The infrastructure for a post-dollar financial system is not being planned. It is being built, tested, and deployed right now. Now let me answer the question in the title. Which currency replaces the dollar? The answer is that no single currency replaces the dollar. The dollar is not being dethroned by a rival king. It is being diluted by a system, a multi-currency, multi-settlement, multi-platform architecture that reduces the dollar's share of global transactions incrementally, year by year, until the dollar is still important, but no longer dominant. Three mechanisms are driving this transition simultaneously. The first is the yuan's growing role in bilateral trade settlement. China now settles approximately 30% of its total trade in yuan, up from essentially zero a decade ago. The yuan's share of global trade finance has risen from 2% to approximately 5% and is accelerating. The second mechanism is the rise of gold as a neutral reserve asset that no country controls, no country can freeze, and no country can weaponize. Central bank gold purchases have exceeded 1,000 tons per year for 3 consecutive years, a pace of accumulation that is systematically replacing dollar reserves with a commodity that carries zero counterparty risk. The third mechanism is digital settlement infrastructure. Central bank digital currencies, bilateral swap lines, and blockchain-based clearing platforms that enable trade settlement without touching the dollar at any point in the transaction chain. The mBridge project involving China, Thailand, the UAE, and Hong Kong has demonstrated that cross-border CBDC settlement can process billions of dollars in transactions at fractions of the cost and time of traditional dollar-based correspondent banking. The weapon systems protecting the dollar, and I use that phrase deliberately because the dollar's reserve status has always been maintained by military force as much as by economic fundamentals, are still deployed. The Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, the carrier strike groups in the Pacific, the global network of military bases that ensures oil flows in dollars and trade clears through American-controlled financial infrastructure. But military force cannot compel a central bank to hold dollars it no longer trusts. You cannot aim a cruise missile at a reserve diversification decision. You cannot sanction a country for buying gold. The military infrastructure that enforced the dollar's monopoly is intact. The monopoly itself is leaking from every joint. In Moscow, de-dollarization is now state policy executed with industrial discipline. Over 60% of Russian trade is conducted in non-dollar currencies. In Beijing, the internationalization of the yuan is the central pillar of China's financial grand strategy. In Riyadh, the Petrobasket pricing mechanism is operational and expanding. In New Delhi, the rupee trade settlement mechanism is active with 18 bilateral partners. In Brasilia, BRICS members are building the institutional infrastructure for a shared settlement platform that would enable intra-BRICS trade without dollar intermediation. First, the dollar's decline from 71% to 56% of global reserves is not a temporary fluctuation. It is a structural trend driven by deliberate policy responses to the weaponization of the dollar system, and it will continue at approximately 1 to 2 percentage points per year, absent a fundamental change in American financial policy. Second, no single currency will replace the dollar. The replacement is a system, a distributed architecture of bilateral agreements, digital platforms, gold reserves, and alternative messaging networks that collectively reduce dollar dependency across every dimension of international finance. Third, the weaponization of SWIFT and the freezing of Russian reserves were the catalytic events that transformed de-dollarization from an academic discussion into an operational emergency for every central bank that holds significant dollar reserves. Fourth, the transition is irreversible in the medium term because the alternative infrastructure has now been built, tested, and deployed at scale, and no amount of American diplomatic pressure can unbuild a payment system that already processes trillions of dollars in annual transactions. Fifth, the economic consequences for the United States will manifest as a gradual reduction in the ability to run deficits without inflationary consequences. Because as global demand for dollars declines, the United States will no longer be able to export its inflation through reserve currency privilege at the scale it has maintained for 50 years. The old money is dying, not in a crash, not in a crisis that makes the front pages, in a slow, steady, mathematically precise erosion of market share that will continue year after year until the dollar is one currency among several rather than the currency above all others. The question is not whether this happens. The IMF data on page 47 already confirms it is happening. The question is whether Washington adapts to a world where the dollar is important but not supreme, or whether it continues to weaponize the very system whose authority depends on being trusted, accelerating the very decline it claims to be preventing. I predicted the decline. The data confirmed the prediction. Now I am predicting the replacement, not a currency, but a system, a web of bilateral agreements, digital currencies, gold reserves, and payment platforms that no single country controls and no single navy can enforce. That system is already operational. The question is how long the United States takes to notice. What do you think replaces the dollar? The yuan, gold, or something that hasn't been named yet? Drop your prediction in the comments. We read every single one. If this analysis opened your eyes, hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Until next time, stay sharp.